Dear guests, dear students, today we are happy to host Mr. Dimitri Lascaris, who is a lawyer, independent journalist from Greece and Canada. So Dimitri also was running for Green Party leadership in 2020 in Canada, finishing the second from 8 candidates. Dimitri, interested in international relations development and Ukraine conflict. But his point of view is different from intellectual mainstream in Western countries. So Dimitri, about 1 week in Moscow, and he visited Ministry of Foreign Affairs already, and he also gave a speech at Valdai Club discussion. So please welcome Dimitri Lascaris.
Thank you. I was saying it's
for record.
okay. You can all hear me fine? Yes. It's a tremendous honor to be here. I've only spent half an hour on your campus, but it's a very impressive facility. And I've heard that this is effectively the elite institution for educating young Russians about international affairs. And your reputation is quite impressive. So I'm honored to be here, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak. This is not obviously an easy time for people from, shall we say, the legal establishment in my country to travel to your country and to try to engage in a dialogue. But I think it's incumbent upon us to do so, because I think that we are in an existentially dangerous conflict which has an extraordinary potential to spiral out of control. And ultimately, we are brothers and sisters. We are all human beings. We all aspire to have good and decent lives, and it's incumbent upon us to make every effort, no matter what our differences may be, to achieve a diplomatic resolution of this conflict. And from my perspective, I have no illusions about the nature of this conflict. My country is at war with your country. And we don't talk about it that way in my country. But what are we doing? We're sending weapons to the primary belligerent party in this conflict, the Ukrainian government. We know and have tacitly approved of the participation in the conflict on the Ukrainian side of former members of the Canadian military. We have provided and continue to provide extensive training to Ukrainian forces, and our own media revealed a year and a half ago that that training included training of members of the Azov battalion, who at that time were openly acknowledged to be neo-Nazi formations. We are providing real-time battlefield intelligence to Ukrainian forces for the purpose of enabling them to strike Russian forces more lethally. We have imposed economic sanctions on Russia, which are designed, they failed to do this, thankfully, but they're designed to deliver a devastating blow to the Russian economy, with the ultimate objective of creating so much political instability that the Russian people demand a change of government. I, as a person of conscience, cannot understand how we as Canadians cannot view this as a state of war. It is war in all but name. And it's time for us to conduct discourse in our country about this war based upon that acknowledgement, and we haven't even gotten to that very preliminary stage yet. So I decided to take matters into my own hands and come here and do whatever I can, make whatever contribution I can to facilitating a dialogue between our peoples. Now, as Deputy Dean Dundic mentioned, I'm a lawyer by training. When I studied law at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 1988 to 1991, many, many years ago, my favorite subject by far was international law. And I was fortunate to be selected by the law school to represent it in the Philip C. Jessup International Law Moot Court Competition, which was named after an American judge of the International Court of Justice. And our team won the Canadian National Championship, and then we went on to Washington, D.C. and participated in the finals where we represented Canada. And we ended up finishing second to the team from Singapore. And from that moment on, I was in love with international law. Regrettably, when I finished my 7 years of university studies, I was burdened by so much debt that I couldn't take a position in my preferred area of expertise because the salaries were inadequate to enable me to pay my debts. So instead, I took a job on Wall Street with a firm called Sullivan & Cromwell, and I became a securities lawyer dealing with stock markets and banks. And one of my biggest clients was Goldman Sachs, as a matter of fact. That for me was a soul-crushing experience, although it was very instructive and enabled me to hone my skills as a lawyer. I then returned to Canada after several years in the New York and Paris offices of that firm. And I went to the other side and became a plaintiff's lawyer and began to represent investors rather than corporations. And by the time I had been practicing law for some 20 years, I was finally able to do what I love to do, which is international affairs and international relations. And since that time, I think it's fair to say that I've become, I don't say this with a sense of arrogance. In fact, it's been painful for me to have to assume this role, but I've become one of the most outspoken critics of Canadian foreign policy. It's a job, it's a dirty job, but it's one that has to be done. And in that position, I've been aided admirably by two colleagues and dear friends of mine, Tamara Lawrence and Eve Engler. And if you're interested in Canadian political commentary on foreign policy, I recommend them to you. Tamara, as I understood it, delivered a lecture here at McGee-Mo a couple of months ago. I hope you had an opportunity to meet her. In January of this year, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, a gentleman by the name of Bob Rae, delivered a speech at the University of Ottawa, where my daughter studies international development. And Tamara and Eve and I decided to attend that speech, frankly with the purpose of disrupting it, because Mr. Rae, to put it bluntly, is a pro-NATO propagandist and has devoted his career to concealing the ugly realities of Canadian foreign policy. And not surprisingly, he titled his speech, Pragmatic and Principled Foreign Policy. The problem with that title is there's nothing principled about Canadian foreign policy, sadly. So we did disrupt his speech. Tamara's went first, and she focused her disruption on the Canadian government's endless and unrelenting support for the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. Eve went second, and she was, of course, forced to leave the room. Eve went second. He focused his criticisms on the voting record of Canada at the United Nations General Assembly, and then I went third, and I focused my criticism on the Canadian government's foreign policies in the Middle East, which are utterly disgraceful. And then this happened to garner a good bit of attention, including from the international media, so Mr. Rae decided to defend himself by issuing a series of tweets, and one of which appears on the screen. And you'll see that what he said, this was the day after our disruption of his speech at the University of Ottawa, he said, in his famous essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, written in 1940, Orwell, obviously George Orwell, took on the appeasers on the right and the left. If you want to win a war, you have to fight it. So he didn't deign to name us. He wouldn't have given us that much importance, but he was obviously referring to us. And so I began thinking about this claim that we, and this is one that's generally hurled at people in Canada who have the courage to denounce the Canadian government's approach to the war in Ukraine. This claim that we are appeasers is obviously intended to suggest that we are appeasing the Russian government. The narrative is that the Russian government is a pure aggressor, that the Ukrainian government is a pure victim, and that anyone who expresses even a modicum of understanding or sympathy for the Russian government's position is appeasing the aggressor. That got me thinking, and I reflected somewhat on this whole notion of appeasement, and I decided to test out a hypothesis which I've long had, and that is that in fact few governments, if any, excel at appeasement as much as the Canadian government. Except in our case, we are not appeasing Russia, of course. We're doing the opposite of that. The party whom we appease every single day is the United States government. And so what I did was I looked in extensive detail at the voting record of Canada at the United Nations General Assembly during the 77th session, which began on September 20th of last year and is ongoing. It's not been completed. And I'm going to go through these figures with you, my findings. I've not yet published these, so you're the first persons who will have seen the results of my analysis. But I will be publishing them after this presentation. And I just want to say a few preliminary things before we look at the numbers. At the United Nations General Assembly, most resolutions are not adopted with a vote. I think somewhere in the range of 30%, however, are adopted with a recorded vote. So you don't know ultimately how, with respect to most resolutions, each country voted. But there's enough now in the 77th session of recorded votes to, I think, draw some interesting conclusions. The number of recorded votes that have happened thus far is 84. And so what I did was, and you'll see this on pages 1 to 10 of the document that I provided. Let me see if I can just scroll up. What I did initially was I examined how often in those 84 cases every country in the world voted in alignment with the United States. So if you look at the page up on the screen, you'll see in the left-hand column there's a country or countries. It's that country's rank. In the middle column, that number at the top, you see Israel 70. That is the number of times Israel voted in alignment with the United States in those 84 instances that I mentioned where there was a recorded vote. And then the right-hand column, you see the region. And I've divided up in the world into what I think are fairly sensible geopolitical regions. I don't think there would be anything controversial about my division. Israel I have allocated to the Middle East and North Africa region. So you will see from this analysis that Israel is by far the country that aligns itself with the United States, at least in the current session of the General Assembly, in the world by a significant margin. And I just want to comment on that briefly. And of course, I should mention, as you can see there up on the screen, that Canada is number 2, sitting alone in second place. Now, you may have noticed that President Joe Biden has an unfortunate tendency to say things that he shouldn't say. One of the more notorious examples was when he, standing beside German Chancellor Olaf Scholz last year, asked by a German reporter what was going to happen to the Nord Stream pipelines if Russia invaded Ukraine, and he said candidly, we will bring an end to Nord Stream. And when the German reporter pressed him on this question and said, well, this is German infrastructure, what do you mean? And he kind of grinned and said to her, trust me, we'll bring an end to Nord Stream if Russia invades Ukraine. He essentially confessed to the crime prior to committing it. And then his underlings, Antony Blinken and Victoria Nuland, openly celebrated the destruction of Nord Stream after the crime had been committed. In any event, he also said something he shouldn't have said with respect to Israel in 2013 when he was the President of the United States. What he said was, if there were not an Israel, we would have to invent one to make sure our interests were preserved. And which is quite consistent with something that I've been saying as a critic of Canadian foreign policy, is that one can view Israel as a gigantic military base in the region of the world that has the richest resources of conventional oil. And it effectively is the hammer that is applied to any disobedient state within the region, particularly nowadays Iran and Syria. You may know that the United States government provides $3.8 billion US in military aid per year to Israel. That is a lot of military aid for a small country like Israel. I think its total population is in the range of 11 million. And of course, it is absolutely critical to Israel's ability to act as a hammer in the region for United States foreign policy. Until the Ukraine war, Israel was the largest recipient of US military aid in history. And I believe that in the space of the last year, it has been supplanted by Ukraine, and that Ukraine is now the largest recipient of US military aid. So it's not surprising, I would submit, to see Israel standing all alone on that lofty perch as the country that votes most often with the United States. Its very existence is owed to the United States, and its ability to impose its will on the region depends critically upon the United States. Now, with that as background, and I'll return to the subject of Canada-Israel relations during my presentation, I want to focus on Canada. So as indicated there, Canada, in second place, voted in 62 out of 84 instances with the United States. That's 73% of the time. This does not reveal, however, the full extent of Canada's alignment with the US. Of the 23 occasions on which Canada did not vote the same way with the United States, it abstained in 11 occasions. In other words, to minimize its departure from the US position. This means that Canada's vote contradicted the US vote in only 12 instances, or 14% of the time. And if we take a closer look at Canada's voting, the extent of its alignment with the United States hegemon becomes even clearer. During the 77th session, the UN General Assembly adopted 11 resolutions relating to the question of Palestinian human rights. In 10 of those 11 cases, Canada joined the United States, Israel, and a small number of tiny island Pacific states like Palau and Marshall Islands in opposing the resolutions. Russia and China supported all of these resolutions. And as you may know, in 2004, the International Court of Justice unanimously ruled that Israeli settlements in the West Bank violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. Even the American judge, who was on the panel for that decision, opined that the settlements violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. You may also know that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the extraordinary Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem have all opined within the last 3 years that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid under international law. And in fact, a friend of mine who's a law professor in Canada and who served as the most recent special rapporteur for the situation in Palestine for the UN Human Rights Council also opined recently that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. And yet Canada continues to defend Israel at the UN General Assembly while claiming to be upholding the human rights of the Ukrainian people in Ukraine. And those of us who believe in the universality of law must ask, are the lives of Palestinians worth less than those of Ukrainians? I'm confident that the Canadian government has no answer to that question. Now, in the 77th session, along with the US, Canada opposed 4 resolutions supporting nuclear disarmament, even though Canada does not have nuclear weapons, nor has it expressed an intention to develop them. Along with the United States, Canada and virtually the entire Western world opposed a resolution supporting a new international economic order. The resolution was supported by 122 states, including the Russian Federation and China. Along with the United States and virtually the entire Western world, Canada opposed a resolution calling for the eradication of rural poverty. The resolution was also supported by 122 states, including the Russian Federation and China. Along with the US and virtually the entire Western world, Canada opposed a resolution calling for the promotion of peace as a vital requirement for the full enjoyment of human rights by all. That resolution was supported by 130 states, including Russia and China. Along with the United States and virtually the entire Western world, Canada opposed a resolution calling for the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. That resolution was supported by 121 states, including Russia and China. Along with the US and virtually the entire Western world, Canada opposed a resolution against the use of unilateral coercive measures. Of course, these are the types of sanctions that have been brought to bear against Russia and with much more devastating effect on countries like Cuba and Venezuela and Iran. That resolution, which opposed unilateral coercive measures, was supported by 129 states, including Russia and China. Canada abstained with respect to a resolution supporting the right to development. This resolution was opposed by the United States. It was supported by 131 states, including Russia and China. Along with the United States and virtually the entire Western world, Canada opposed a resolution for combating the glorification of Nazism. This resolution was supported by 119 states, including Russia and China. Along with the US and virtually the entire Western world, Canada opposed a resolution calling for practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space. The resolution was supported by 114 states, including Russia and China. I'm sorry to burden you with all of these details, but I hope that I will have made my point adequately clear that the voting record of Canada and its Western allies, and above all the United States, which dominates them in this year's session of the United Nations General Assembly, is one of absolute disgrace, and it's one of which each and every Canadian of conscience should be embarrassed, and I am. I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed. None of these votes can be reconciled with the rhetoric of the Canadian government or the lofty principles with which Bob Rae invoked in his capacity as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations in his speech last January in Ottawa. These votes, however, can be reconciled with the agenda of the United States government, and the way to make sense of them is to view them as a vehicle for enabling that government to achieve its global agenda of hegemony. As we all know, I would imagine this is something you've appreciated by now, the US invasion of Iraq was a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter. Although this is less widely acknowledged, I believe in my capacity as an international lawyer that its invasion of Afghanistan was a violation of the United Nations Charter. And whether you believe that the initial invasion was itself a violation, certainly there were extensive war crimes committed during the 20 years of occupation. And besides all of that, our government propped up a narco-dictatorship that was extraordinarily brutal, as did the other allies of Canada in the West. We could say the same about our policies with respect to Syria, with respect to Libya, which now lies in smoking ruins. In all of these instances, led by the United States, Americans and others from the West committed multiple violations of the United Nations Charter and international humanitarian law, and Canada has failed to demand that any of the US officials who are responsible for these crimes be held accountable. Not a single one, even in the case of torture. In 2007, Barack Obama, when he was running for the first time to be the President of the United States, openly acknowledged in a bid to garner support from the progressive community in the United States that waterboarding is torture. By that point in time, declassified documents of the United States government had left no doubt in anybody's mind that the US government had engaged in waterboarding at Guantanamo Bay and black sites around the world, and that this had been authorized by officials at the highest levels of the United States government during the Bush administration. So, coupled with the admission by Barack Obama, you have a slam dunk case of a war crime. Anybody with a modicum of intellectual sophistication as a lawyer would be able to secure a conviction before the International Criminal Court of George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice, at a minimum for committing the war crime of torture or authorizing the use of torture by underlings in the CIA. And yet, my country's government has never once demanded any of these people be held accountable. On the contrary, what we do is we facilitate their rehabilitation in the public's mind. now turning them into, from war criminals into respectable political figures whose sage advice in international affairs is worth pursuing. So I would submit to you that when we look at the inglorious record, the real appeasers are the ministers of the Canadian government who determine Canada's foreign policy. They are not Tamara Lorentz, they're not Yves Engler, not me, not anybody who is calling for this war in Ukraine to be brought to an end by peaceful means as soon as possible. Now, once I began to look closely at Canada's voting record in the 77th session of the United Nations, I began to notice a number of other interesting facts. First, of the nations, the 50 nations that voted with the US most often, 42 of them, or 84%, are Western nations. You can see this, I'm not going to scroll through it now, but you can see it on pages 1 to 3 of the chart. Only one of the top 50 is from Africa, and that country is Liberia. Only 2 of the top 50 are from Asia, and unsurprisingly, those 2 countries are Japan and South Korea. Now, if we go to page 10 of this document, I've tabulated the results here, and you can see that Western states, on average, in 49 instances on average, they voted with the United States in those 84 resolutions, so that's 58% of the time. The next region that voted with the United States most frequently was Latin America and the Caribbean. They voted with the United States 37% of the time. Middle East and North Africa voted with the United States 30% of the time. These tiny Pacific Island states, over which, by the way, the United States has a considerable degree of influence, voted 30% of the time with the United States. Asia, only 27% of the time. Middle East and North Africa, if you exclude the outlier Israel, voted with the United States only 26% of the time. And very interestingly, Africa voted the least with the United States, only 23% of the time, a little less than 1 in 4. And now, if we go up 1 page, there's another interesting chart. So this is looking at this data from a slightly different perspective. What I tried to do was to determine, and this was a fairly time-consuming exercise, what level of international support there was for the position taken by 4 countries. I chose these 4 countries for obvious reasons, I think. And the countries I looked at were China, Russia, Canada, and the United States. And what I found was the position taken by China in these 84 resolutions was the one that enjoyed the broadest level of support amongst the international community. On average, China's position was supported by 107.5 votes. Russia came in second place with, on average, 89.4 votes, aligning with the position of the Russian Federation. My country finished third, although if it's any consolation, we finished well above the United States with 87.3 votes on average. And there you have at the bottom the outlier, the United States government, which had the support of, on average, only 64.6 votes in these 84 resolutions. And so I have to question, I mean, obviously, when we look at the question of isolation, we hear a lot in the West about isolation of Russia and China. I don't think these statistics lend any support whatsoever to the notion that China and Russia have been isolated internationally. If anything, you look at these statistics, it's the United States that's isolated internationally, and to a lesser degree, Canada. But certainly the positions being taken by China and Russia in the current session of the United Nations General Assembly, to the extent we're able to ascertain how people voted, enjoy a higher level of public support, international support, than the positions being taken by the United States. That's absolutely clear. And it's remarkable, I would say, that this is happening in this session because we are seeing an unprecedented effort being made by the West to isolate China and Russia. So those efforts, if these statistics are any indication, are not bearing much fruit, but that's not what we hear in the West. What we hear in the West is that your countries are being increasingly isolated, and that Western government thinking is the prevailing attitude of the international community. So the last thing I want to talk about is recent, and again within the context of this question of appeasement and Canadian foreign policy and whether it's truly sovereign, is the admission of Finland into NATO. And the question I ask, and I would have thought that this should be the question that we in Canada should have been asking from the outset, is how does Finland's admission into NATO enhance Canada's security? I must say at the outset, so I don't want there to be any confusion about this, I have absolutely no military expertise whatsoever. I've never served in the military, I've never studied the military sciences, but I'd like to think I have a functioning brain, and that we should all use our brains to the extent they're functioning to examine these questions of national policy, and we shouldn't simply defer to what our elected officials tell us. So there you have a map of North America, obviously, and I, as a non-military person, I look at that map and I say, wow, Canada is protected by formidable natural barriers. On the west, we are protected by the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. In the east, the vastness of the Atlantic. To the south, we share a border with only one country, the United States. It's the longest undefended border in the world. We have not been at war with the United States in over 200 years. And in the north, we have the Arctic. And we are separated from the Russian Federation by not only the Arctic waters, but also, for much of the year, almost impenetrable ice. So, again, a layperson looking at the natural barriers to an invasion of Canada would ask, if for some reason, and I don't contend that there is a reason to believe this, but if for some reason the Russian government or the Chinese government were inclined to invade Canada, I imagine that they would confront Herculean logistical obstacles to maintaining a military presence on Canadian soil. And quite apart from that, I don't think any sensible person has any illusions about how the United States government would react if there were an attempt by any hostile power to invade Canada. Whether there's a NATO treaty or isn't a NATO treaty, the United States would not hesitate to intervene to protect its own security interests. And frankly, it wouldn't care in the slightest what Canada's government has to say about it. It would not allow itself to be threatened by a hostile military presence on its northern border. So I think it's sensible to assume, and I think that this is exactly what governments around the world do. They assume that the United States, which has by far the largest military budget in the world, would act forcefully to protect itself in the event of hostile military action being taken against Canada. And this acts as a very powerful deterrent, obviously. Any country wishing to invade Canada would not only confront these enormous logistical obstacles, but would also have to deal with the wrath of the United States. So Canada is in a relatively, again, in my layperson's view, non-military view, is in a privileged position from a security perspective. Then over to the right of the map, there is, of course, Finland. Finland shares a border with Russia. I'm not intimately familiar with the details of this, but I understand that Finland and Russia within the past 100 years fought at least 2 wars. It's also my understanding that Finland and Russia have rather tense relations at the moment. So I'm looking at this map and I'm thinking, and by the way, there is no massive military force, on Finland's border waiting to pounce, or incentivized, frankly, to pounce if Finland were to be invaded. So I'm looking at this situation and I'm saying Canada is already have formidable protection, whereas Finland is relatively vulnerable compared to the Canadian. That's not to say, I'm not suggesting that, the Russian Federation or China or any other military power is looking to commit an act of aggression against Finland, but I think just looking at this objectively, Finland is much more vulnerable than Canada. In addition, Canada is a much larger country than Finland. We have a population that is 7 times larger than that of Finland, 38.3 million versus 5.4 million. Our GDP is almost 7 times larger than Finland's, $2 trillion versus $297 billion. Canada's military budget is about 4.5 times larger than Finland's, US 27 billion versus 6 billion. Given these facts, it would seem obvious, again to a non-military person, that Canada's ability to aid in the defense of Finland is much greater than Finland's ability to aid in Canada's defense. And in fact, Finland is so small that it's questionable whether it could make any meaningful contribution to the defense of Canada if Article 5 of the NATO treaty were triggered by an attack upon Canada by a non-NATO member. So again, I ask the question, how does Finland's admission into NATO enhance Canada's security interests? I think the answer is relatively obvious. It doesn't. Effectively, what we've done is taken on additional security risk by adding Finland, which shares a border with nuclear-armed Russia, with no corresponding security benefit. And yet in our country, there was no meaningful debate about the security benefits and the security risks attached to Finland's admission into NATO. Absolutely none. Nobody even put forward an unconvincing case. There was no case put forward. In fact, all that we heard to justify this was Finland and Canada have been friends for a very long time. That was it. That was the sum total of the argument that was made. No one ever explained why we couldn't remain friends outside of NATO. There was absolutely no reason to think that that couldn't continue. And again, I come back to the point I've been trying to make, that I think if you try to understand what the Canadian government did here, it was yet another instance of appeasement. The United States government wanted Finland to be part of NATO, and even though Finland's admission certainly didn't provide any security benefit to Canada and quite possibly diminished its security, Canada went along with it nonetheless. So at the end of the day, going back to Mr. Bobry's tweet, I think he needs to reconsider his position and begin to ask himself who the real appeasers are in this scenario. So with that, I thank you all for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dimitri. In order to start discussion, I'm always asked first on a administrative right, like a deputy dean, I start. Okay. First, I want to say that it comes to me that presence of foreign force in Canada would create a new Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So reaction would be like this, like Soviet rockets on Cuba in 1961. So it would be practically the same. And it comes to me that you compared Canada foreign policy and Finland foreign policy. But as far as you have double citizenship, could you compare it with Greece policy? Canada and Greece, these countries have practically the same position, or they have any differences according to their foreign policy goals and achievements, alliance with NATO, position to United States, position to Russia? And we also have here today our deputy head of department, Anna Andreevna Toropova, who is specialist in Greece, so she will be interested in this also, as well.
I am, yes, a citizen of Greece as well. In fact, I split my time between Greece and Canada nowadays. Admittedly, I'm not as familiar with Greek politics as with Canadian, but I think I'm familiar enough to answer your question, Deputy Dean. And sadly, if anything, Greece is even more subservient in terms of its foreign policy to the United States than Canada. It's certainly not less subservient. It's certainly not more independent. And I'll give you one example, and that is that the polls in Greece, I believe, have shown consistently that a majority of Greeks are opposed to the provision of weapons to Ukraine. But the Greek government has honored any demand that it's capable of honoring in terms of the provision of military weapons to Ukraine. It has simply disregarded the will of the Greek people. In Canada, interestingly, there was majority support for the provision of weapons to Ukraine for some time at the beginning of the special military operation. So at least for the initial period of this conflict, that part of Canadian foreign policy was consistent with the polling. But in February of this year, a poll commissioned interestingly by a right-wing newspaper, I think they were quite surprised by the result. In Canada, they found that now the Canadians are in the same boat as the Greeks. A majority do not support the provision of further weapons to Ukraine. In fact, the number had gone down to 32%. I would love to be proven wrong about this, but I think that the Canadian government is going to do exactly what the Greek government is doing and will, as long as it's instructed to do so by Washington, continue to provide weapons to Ukraine, notwithstanding the position, the polling in the country. So both Greece and Canada in this regard are essentially the same. There was one interesting, in Greece at least, tussle around this issue recently. I believe Greece has an S-400 missile defense system. It's either S-300 or S-400, which it purchased from the Russian Federation. And as you may know, Greece has rather, I'm sure you know this, and your students may as well, that Greece has rather tense relations historically with Turkey. And so there was a big brouhaha in Greece's parliament about this because the conservative government was thinking very, very seriously for months about sending that air defense system to Ukraine, and finally it relented, and didn't send it. But it didn't decline the request of the Ukrainian government to send the S-300 system to Ukraine on the basis of the will of the Greek people. It did it because it felt that that was going to create a security risk for Greece in its potential conflict with Turkey.
Thank you, Dimitri. Please. Questions, comments, please.
First of all,
welcome
to Russia.
Thank you.
My name is Karen, and we wish you all a very productive stay in Russia. It will last around a month, as far as I understood. And I appreciated the analysis which you made on the Canadian foreign policy, which is very easy to grasp. It's very representative, and today when we're bombarded with information and we need very firm images to visualize what's going on, this is a very good thing. It does the job creating a very firm understanding of what's going on. So that aside, I have a very direct question. I watched a part of your recent conference on the Ukrainian conflict, and you mentioned in your speech also you mentioned the UN Charter regarding Iraq and Afghanistan, and in that video you were speaking about the provoked nature of the conflict. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you note that you as a lawyer view the Russian actions as a breach of the UN Charter. I would like to know what makes you come to this conclusion. Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned that after digging deeper into the history of the conflict, you're inclined to doubt that this is the case. So you even said likely violates the UN Charter. So I'd like to know what you think.
Thank you for your kind remarks, and that's an excellent and obviously very important question. I'll preface my answer by pointing out that in the law, things are rarely black and white, right? What you do as a lawyer, and I'm a litigator, so I go into courts and I contest legal questions, and in advising my clients, I have to make predictions about how courts will decide the dispute. And, you know, usually what you come up with after you've done extensive evidentiary research and research of the law is a range of possible outcomes to which you attach various probabilities. That's how the law actually works. It isn't like, this is the answer and that's not the answer. It's much more probabilistic than that. And this dispute between Russia and Ukraine is no different. So all I can do, as a lawyer is look at a range of possible outcomes if this were to be litigated before a neutral arbiter. And I think that likely the analysis would go along the following lines. That the United Nations Charter, which was developed out of the horrors of the two world wars and sought to the maximum possible degree to limit the circumstances in which the use of force by one state against another could be done permissibly, it defines very narrowly when military force may be employed by a state. And one of them, of course, is self-defense. Now, there are circumstances in international law where you don't have to actually wait to be attacked, okay, which is sensible. But the law says that the attack must be imminent. It must be imminent. So I'm not aware of persuasive evidence that at the time that the special military operation commenced, the Ukrainian military was planning an attack on the internationally recognized boundaries of Russia. There's plenty of evidence that it was planning to attack the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk, that it was going to launch military action, in addition to all of the other horrors that it visited upon the Ukrainian people in the 8 years prior. But as that evidence was accumulating in international law, the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk were not considered to be independent states. So what the Putin government did, which is very interesting, and I understand that Vladimir Putin is a lawyer, and he, like me, he thinks legalistically. As I understand what happened here, and the deputy dean can correct me if I'm wrong about this, very quickly when it became apparent that an attack was unfolding or about to unfold on the Donbass and the pro-Russian forces, the two People's Republic, Luhansk and Donetsk, declared independence. They were all, I think this all happened within the space of 48 hours. And then Russia recognized them as states, and then they called upon Russia to intervene militarily. So, of course, if they were independent sovereign states in international law at that time, what they did was entirely within their right. There was absolutely no impediment to them saying, we're about to be attacked, we want you to come and help us, even if they were wrong. Even if they were wrong about their belief that they were going to be attacked, they had the sovereign right as sovereign states to invite a foreign military power to come to their aid and defense. The issue then becomes, were they sovereign states in international law? Is the mere fact that they declared sovereignty and the Russian Federation recognized them as sovereign states sufficient? I think that's a dicey question. That's a dicey question. Now, there's one other thing I want to say about this, though, and that is there's also this doctrine of the responsibility to protect. I don't know if you were going to ask about that, which the U.S. and dishonest allies have repeatedly invoked. For example, in the case of Libya, they invoked it just before they laid waste to the entire country. They invoked it in Syria before they aided in the destruction of that country. And it's precisely because of what the West has done with that doctrine that I have profound skepticism about it. I think Russia probably was very much motivated to protect the people. I think it was genuine desire on the part of the Russian government to protect the peoples of the Donbass. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if they invoked the responsibility to protect. But when you look at the historical, and certainly no one could accuse them from the West. I mean, anybody from the West who criticizes them for invoking it would be a hypocrite, because we've done that repeatedly. But I have reservations about it because it's been so abused. And at the same time, I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but this is very important. There is one other thing I want to say, and that is, I totally understand the predicament of the Russian Federation, because, the other alternative was to go to the Security Council, and we all know what would have happened there. The veto power of the permanent members would have been deployed to prevent any kind of defensive action being taken with the consent of the Security Council to protect the people of the Donbass. And there's this really interesting, I don't know if you know who Norman Finkelstein is. He's an academic in the United States who's extremely critical, like me, of Western foreign policy. And, you know, he did an interview at the outset, and he said he's very, very anti-imperialist. And he said, you know, what were the Russians supposed to do? Like, just sit there and let them steamroll the people of the Donbass? I have a lot of sympathy for that position, admittedly.
May I add a remark to further our discussion? So, casting aside the moral motivations of my country's actions, I'd like to go straight to the status of Lugansk and Donetsk. So, the question of international recognition as a necessary condition for countries' independence is a topic of discussion in international law. And what I'd like to draw our attention to in this case is it's very hard to say that Lugansk and Donetsk were part of Ukraine. What I mean by that is not only de facto war between those two entities, is also I'm speaking more about the attitudes of the Ukrainian regime towards the people of Donbass. You don't treat your citizens like that. Even as far as I remember, it was Poroshenko who said that during the New Year's Eve, presidents of the post-Soviet countries, they make the New Year address to their nation, and during that address he said, our children will celebrate the New Year like normal people, while your kids will do that in the bunkers, something like that. So that demonstrates that they are clearly not treated as part of that country. So what are they? And that makes me think that here international recognition is not necessary, even because the country in which these entities are supposed to be in doesn't treat them as their own citizens, as a part of their country. So why do we need international recognition in these circumstances? So, and this makes us think in general about the question of what the Ukrainian elites are. Are they the representation of the Ukrainian people? Because you also mentioned that this was a real coup in 2014 in that very video.
The most blatant coup in history, as Stratfor's presence. Yes.
So many adjectives can be used to describe that event. So taking into consideration these factors, do we really need international recognition for Russia to come to the aid of the people who are basically going to get slaughtered? We're going to get slaughtered, if not the intervention.
I think it's important to distinguish between a moral justification and a legal justification, because those are not the same thing. And the law can be quite unjust. You can have situations where a legal regime is just most of the time, but under a peculiar set of circumstances becomes unjust, but it is the law nonetheless. So I think from a moral perspective, I certainly understand what you're saying. I think that the Ukrainian government forfeited the right to rule over the people of the Donbass from the moment it began to attack them, from the moment it began to adopt laws which circumscribed their language rights, which rendered them second-class citizens, from the moment that it began to tolerate abuses by neo-Nazi formations in the military of Ukraine towards the people of the Donbass. This was, the moral right was gone, but legally, this may be one of those circumstances in which the legal regime in question was unjust. And at the end of the day, I come back to the same thing I said about the responsibility to protect. If you confer upon the Russian Federation the right to intervene in those circumstances, you can be sure that other states are going to invoke it when it suits their interest to do so, and that the right is going to be abused some of the time, and it has been abused. Effectively, what I think you're doing is you're articulating a kind of responsibility to protect argument, and that's a thorny issue. For me, the ultimate way to resolve all of this is to have a true method of international legal enforcement that is, we say in our country, justice is blind. In other words, that isn't depend upon the identity of the wrongdoer or the identity of the victims. It's applied in all cases with equal vigor. But we don't have that.
Do you see the UN? Do you think that the UN has to be largely reformed?
Karen, last comment. Last comment. One question, one answer.
Does the UN have to be reformed, and if yes, in what way?
Does the UN have to be reformed?
Yes.
Absolutely. It's a complete and utter failure. I'm sorry to say, it's another failure. It's the veto power is a problem. The fact that voting within the United States General Assembly, you have it's ridiculous. You have a country like Palau. It's a little tiny island state with 20,000 people, has the same weight in the General Assembly as China and India. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Maybe you have some kind of weighted voting system which reflects the distribution of the population. The funding of the United Nations is a disaster. You always pay the piper, and most of the funding, as I understand it, or a disproportionate amount of it, is coming from the United States, which gives it a disproportionate influence over the conduct of the UN business.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for your expert opinion and deep analysis. I will read my question because up to the moment I haven't spoken English for a long time, mostly Greek on my lessons. As far as I'm specializing in Greece, my question concerns this country. Lastly, foreign policy of Greece is very framed, and our two countries stopped any collaboration. And what do you think? Does it mean that one day all our activities that we had a very active collaboration for a long time, for many years. Mm-hmm. Does it be able to restart it? Because it's a very serious problem for us, because and in the historical sphere, in culture sphere, we had a very good and deep collaboration. And just say some words about this. What is your opinion?
I was raised, my parents emigrated to Canada from Greece in the 1950s. And at that point, Canada had this thing called multiculturalism, which encouraged ethnic communities to maintain their identity. And I was raised as a Greek my whole life. The first language I learned, even though I was born and raised in Canada, was Greek. And as this hostility towards the Russian Federation evolved following, the end of the Yeltsin era, I found it all quite bizarre because I was not raised that way. I was not raised to view the Russian people as an enemy. I was raised to view them as cousins, brothers and sisters, family. And I think that that's the predominant view in Greece. As a matter of fact, my house in Greece is up on a mountain outside of Kalamata, and it's like 3 kilometers to climb up the mountain. And when I go up that mountain, I can see carved onto the walls of the mountain 4 Zs. I counted them. The symbol of the Russian military in Ukraine. I've only seen one in Moscow, interestingly. I've seen 4 of them. So the sympathy is there, but ultimately, look, back, I don't know if you recall this, but I think back in 2015 when this party, Syriza, which characterized itself as radically left, won, there was talk for a time because the Europeans were imposing this crushing austerity regime on Greece. And they were looking for another way out. And there was talk, they met with, Tsipras actually met with Vladimir Putin, President Putin, and they had a discussion about Russia providing financial aid to Greece. But he came under intense pressure from the European Union to have no such dealings with the Russian Federation. And since then, there was this, I don't know if you recall this, there was a referendum about austerity. The no side won resoundingly. Syriza immediately capitulated anyways, And since that moment, Greece has been ruled from Brussels. 100%. We just do whatever they tell us. So to answer your question, as long as Brussels says no relationship with the Russian Federation, Greece will take that order. Personally, I hope that the EU disintegrates. I think that would be the best thing for Greece, that we just collapse in an orderly way, without violence, that it just disintegrates and that we start all over again.
Thank you for your...
Well, thank you very much for coming out. It's a great honor to hear you today in such a tough period of time to our country. And my question will be a little bit personal, because I've noted some things that you said. You said that weapons delivery from Canada, from NATO, military participation of Canada to that situation in Ukraine. So how did you get that point of view? What made you to think different, not to follow the mainstream, and try to, as a scientist, understand what's going on in this world? Because nowadays, I talk with my friends from states, from other countries, they just follow the mainstream. They are not trying to even understand what's going on, what means to Russia that Ukrainian situation. What made you to think about it? Because it's very interesting to me. Thank you.
You know, it's hard to summarize one's political evolution, you know, within the space time available to us. I'll try to be as brief as I can. First of all, my parents, when they emigrated, didn't have any high school education, not even a year. So we were brought up in quite humble circumstances. When I went off to Wall Street and started working, I felt very much out of place because I was surrounded by people who came from, you know, to the extent the U.S. has an aristocracy, you know, everybody had a Roman numeral at the end of their name, and they had all gone to private schools and to Ivy League universities, and I just didn't feel right there. And I then came back to Canada, and then so I was starting to gravitate away from that world, and I knew that I just didn't belong there. But then in 2004, there was a pivotal moment in my political evolution, and that is a good friend of mine recommended that I read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. From the moment I opened that book, I couldn't put it down. I don't know if you've read it. It's extremely thick and dense. It's very, very granular analysis of geopolitics. But I just devoured the book, and when I put it down, I was overwhelmed with anger. I've been lied to my whole life. Everything I've been told about our government is a flat-out falsehood, and the media is a willing and enthusiastic participant in deceiving us about the reality of our government. And then I just, you know, I kind of went nuts. So, like, you know, I just became an outspoken critic. And
Thank you very much, and thank you for your research on UN voting. It's very interesting, and it's a great honor to be first to hear that results, and I wish you'll have great reviews on it. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Lily. First of all, thank you for visiting our university. It's a great pleasure for us to have a conversation with you. So you have mentioned that United Nations must be reformed as it's unfair, absolutely. And in this case, I would like to know your opinion on non-proliferation treaty, since this treaty, well, it is absolutely unfair in its nature, and many countries would really like to change it. What do you think about it?
Well, you know, it is a failure. It is being observed only in name. You know, the United States, as I'm sure you have had occasion to discuss here, withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. I think that was 2001. It withdrew from the Trump administration from the JCPOA with Iran, even though the International Atomic Energy Agency certified that Iran was complying with it. Then Trump withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I think in 2015, Obama announced a $1 trillion modernization of the nuclear forces. You know, in what sense is any of this non-proliferation? I mean, it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. I think we do need to start all over again. I think a good place to begin was the nuclear weapons ban treaty, which of course, you know, the nuclear powers oppose. But ultimately, and I think this is more important than for the people of your generation than for mine, because I've had a good long life, we have to rid this world of nuclear weapons. And, that must begin with resurrecting the nuclear non-proliferation architecture and beginning step by step to do what Gorbachev and Reagan did, which was to decrease in ever more assertive amounts the size of nuclear arsenals until we get to zero. But we're headed in the wrong direction.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, this is very difficult to eliminate threat of nuclear weapon if we already created it, if it exists. So this is kind of gin, like that. This is difficult to put it to the bottle again. Anybody else? Okay, so dear Dimitri, thank you for a wonderful lecture. It was a good chance for us to host you here today, and I hope we see you in some future and you will connect your Canadian society to get closer to Russian society, idealistically and mentally and any different ways. So good luck on your difficult job, because I understand that it's difficult to construct this idea in Canada nowadays, unfortunately. But I'm optimistical and I hope that everything will be good and we achieve peace finally.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.